I'm going to speak on compassion this morning, and the message is based on the listening that I've been doing particularly while I was staying with Mum for the 5 weeks that Dad was in hospital and away at Presswood Lodge. Obviously Mum goes to bed a bit earlier than me, so I was lie in bed, listening to some of the Bible Project podcasts. And Howard and I have talked a little bit about these because he's also been listening to them. And I would recommend that you also listen to some of them because they've been a real blessing to me. We're going to look at the little video as a summary at the end of what I'm going to share with you this morning. So the series is actually called The Character of God. And I really felt that I should share what I'd learned so that you can benefit from that, and hopefully it'll encourage you to go away and do a bit more digging and learn about the rest. So we're looking at the character of God. So if I asked you to have a think about and perhaps write down a bit about your own character, what you would write, sort of bit OCD perhaps, or grumpy, or very organised character, or you know the kind of things that might come readily to mind for yourself. All right, but then a different question: what do you think you would write if I asked you to write? Well, what's God's character like? And I'm not asking you to tell me what you think. I want to hear. All those trite answers that you might trot out because you know your Bibles. All right, but what you actually genuinely think of God's character is like when you think about him. So we have the advantage of our scriptures, and in our scriptures, amazingly, God describes himself. He lays it down in Exodus chapter 34. So if we could have the first slide up, please. All right. He gives us his own, what us teachers call a baseline. All right. This is what it is. All right. This is what God says about himself. And it comes after the incident with the golden calf and all the horror that was. All right. And Moses goes back up the mountain to go and get the second set of tablets of stone. And he has a long conversation with God up the mountain. He asks if he could see God. And God gives him permission to see just the rear part of him as he passes by. And as God passes by in Exodus 34, verse 6 and 7, this is what God tells Moses about himself. And it says, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in loyal love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now, if that last little bit concerns you, I suggest you go and have a listen to the other podcasts while he explains to you, all right, the sins of the third and fourth generation. Basically, it is that oftentimes in families that pattern of sin is kind of set up, and contrast the third and fourth with the thousands that's in the first part of the verse. That tells you something about God's compassion, but also his need for justice. Would you want to live in a world where there was no justice at all? Where there was nothing ever done about the wrongs in the world? We're thinking about remembrance this morning, and some people felt that it was necessary to do something about the unjustness of Nazi Germany and so on in our world. So for today's message then, compassionate. So the next slide, please. The God of compassion feels deep emotion. Now, I don't know whether you ever think of God actually having emotion. Some of us find it difficult to show emotion. Oftentimes we think men find it difficult to show emotion. The Hebrew word for compassion is rachamim, And the word we translate as compassionate is rachum. These two words are rooted in the Hebrew word for the womb, which is rachem. So the Bible author of Exodus chose this word because it really draws our attention to God having a nurturing part of his nature, like a mother would nurture the baby that's still in her womb. We take good care of the babies in our wombs. We go to the doctors and, we get special care while we're carrying our babies to make sure that everything can be as good as possible when the time comes to be born. God is like that. And we have an example in 1 Kings chapter 3 of the use of this word, and it's in the story of Solomon having to judge between the two ladies the one son had died and the other one was still remained, and they were arguing as to whose son was whose. And the verse reads this: Then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred, and the word rachum is used there, over her son, and said, "Oh Lord, give her," that's the other woman, "the living child, and by no means kill him." That was the deep emotion that this mother felt. She preferred him to go to the other woman than see him killed with the sword. So that's the kind of love that mothers have. But is this the kind of love, the caring so deeply, that you actually understand as being part of the character of God? Just think about that for a minute. Do you see God like that, with that level of deeply felt emotion and compassion? As part of the learning for this, I found out that 80% of the references to compassion in our Bibles refer to God's compassion to us as human beings. And only a measly 20% are references to human compassion towards others. So the Bible, a big theme in the Bible, you could say, 80% of the references are about God's compassion. Okay, the next slide, please. So the next one, leading kind of on from that, we're saying that God is like a nurturing mother. So here I put God is a compassionate parent to his vulnerable child. So we know about the story with Solomon and the two ladies. In Isaiah chapter 49, verses 15 and 16, we have another depiction of God as a nursing mother, feeding the baby. In this example, Israel themselves are accusing God for forgetting them and abandoning them because they're in exile. And they don't understand why God hasn't shown up. And God, through the prophet Isaiah, says this to them: Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she's born? Well, though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. This is what God tells his people in Israel. God cares for and nurtures his people just like a nursing mother would. Now, we know that as mums, I know as a mum, there were lots of times when I failed the boys. All right? There were lots of times when I didn't want to get up and feed them in the night for a start. That was tough going for those weeks. But you get up and do it. But God isn't like that. All right? He always has compassion towards us. We fail, God never does. All right? He will never fail to show his compassion. And I'm sure that little line, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands, must surely be a reference to the nail prints at the crucifixion. Jesus still bears those scars in heaven, and those scars speak deeply of the love that he has for all of us. And he can never forget. They will always be there. we should never forget. Okay, the next slide. The next one is, so that's a mother. We also perhaps more readily think of God as a father. All right, in Psalm 103, verses 13 and 14, we read, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed, and he remembers that we are dust." All right, at the end of the day, we are just dust. And God remembers that. He knows that we are frail human beings and that our characters are deeply flawed. He remembers that. And he is full of compassion as a father. And when I think of God as a father, automatically kind of go to the story of the prodigal son, which Mark referred to again last week. All right? The huge moral failure of the son is immediately met and forgiven by the compassion of the father, who was thrilled to have him back in the family home. Nothing was too much trouble. Nothing was too expensive. He threw the best party ever to have because his son had come back. So we get that picture of God. So we get God as a mother. Perhaps we don't think so much about that, but lots of times we think of God as a father. And I think that's important because God created us as men and women, and God relates to both those character traits. He is not just a father, all right, but he is also like our mothers as well. Male and female, God created us, and he has those male and female emotions too. So God is in a place where he has the power to intervene. And when he feels that deep compassion, he chooses to show that compassion and bring the help that is needed, perhaps desperately needed, at any particular point. He will look on us and see us and feel us with compassion and will act. So that kind of leads me to the next one, Sam, please, that we can be confident in God's compassion and action. Because compassion isn't just a feeling. It is a feeling. Compassion will move us to tears. So that it is definitely a feeling, it's definitely an emotion, but it is also an action. Often in the Bible, that we get this, and again in the story of the prodigal son, that the father didn't just feel sad that he'd gone away and happy when he returned. He also acted to show that by throwing the huge party and also having to then explain to the younger son why he'd done what he'd done. It wasn't just a feeling. He showed it in action. And I've heard quite a lot of speakers speak about the word compassion. And I think the one that resonated most with me is that compassion is love in action. Love in action. Not just a feeling, but actually doing something about it. And that love, it's like putting his work clothes on, putting your togs on and your rubber gloves and so on, and getting dirty. All right, to sort something out, not to be afraid, to start to get in where it's needed and show the love in action. For this, I want to just look at the story of David and Bathsheba. I don't need to go into details because you all know the story. And surely, after that terrible failure of David, you'd say that it would have been quite okay for God to say, "I'll call time on that one." What a waste of space David is. All right? What's the point in me investing any further time and bother in David after the way he's just failed? But nothing could be further from the truth, because although David certainly knew he didn't deserve to be forgiven and restored, and that God would have been just in that, we find in Psalm 51, and I think those words are up on the screen, that David, in his prayer to God, confessing his sin, uses 3 out of the 5 characteristics that God says he has in that passage we started with in Exodus 34. He says to God in his prayer, "Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgression." So he pleaded with God on those 3 things: graciousness, loving kindness, and compassion. David knew that his sin was great and that he deserved to be punished. But he also remembered, and this is why we need to know our Bibles. David would have known these words from when he was knee-high to a grasshopper. All right, he knew that God had said when he'd been talking to Moses up the mountain that God was, as we found in Exodus 34 verse 6, that he's compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. So David knew that God had forgiven sin, terrible sin, before. Surely he could plead that now, and God would listen, because he believed God to also be God of compassion. God's compassion is promised to anyone who cries out to him in their time of need. Next slide, please, Sam. Isaiah 55 verse 7 says this: "Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return, like the prodigal, to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." And we know in lots of other places in our Old Testament scriptures that the Israelites were constantly getting themselves in a pickle by walking away from God, getting into trouble, and then having to cry out to God. And in Nehemiah chapter 9, we read that God could no longer leave the guilty unpunished, and he sent the Israelites away into exile because of their sin. But the passage reads like this: God placed them in the hand of their oppressors who oppressed them. But when they cried, notice that, when they cried to him in their time of distress, he heard from heaven, and according to his great compassion, he gave them deliverers who delivered them from the hand of their oppressors. So in that story, God acted justly by sending the Israelites away. He had to do something about the way they had been behaving. But having sent them away, he always had a plan to bring them back when they came to their senses. Again, like the prodigal, he came to his senses and realised. They cried out to God for rescue, and God was willing and ready to rescue him. So we can know that same confidence that God will look on us with compassion when we humbly cry out, when we acknowledge how badly we've messed up again in a particular situation. And so I just want to pause there for a minute, and I want you to think for yourself, is that where perhaps you are today? Do you feel like 1,000,000 miles away from God because of something that you've either said or done, or not said and done, that you know is wrong, and perhaps you've just allowed yourself to drift away from God? Be encouraged. Be encouraged, because God, when you recognise your need, will be ready to welcome you back. Cry out to him and he will respond. We have that confidence from God's words that he will respond. Next slide, please, Sam. So, if we move on from just thinking about God, think about your Bible, we go through the Old Testament, and we come to Jesus in the New Testament, and we find that Jesus is God's compassion. right? We know that the compassion of God is most clearly seen when Jesus comes, because he is able to show God's compassion in a human. All right? In John chapter 14, Philip asks Jesus to show us the Father. Philip and the other disciples, I'm sure, all right, wanted to see the Father. Show us the Father, they said. And Jesus' reply was this: anyone who has seen me, seen Jesus, has seen the Father. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least, notice this, believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Now, at Christmas time, which we're coming up to, we sing a lot about Jesus is Emmanuel, don't we? Emmanuel, God with us. So the character of God that we've learnt about in the Old Testament is also found in Jesus, because he is God. So he literally embodies the compassion of God the Father. And there are lots of references to this in our New Testaments. I want you to remember compassion goes with action. And the one that immediately sprang to mind as I was preparing it was the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. We know, because we get the shortest verse, don't we, in that? And what does the shortest verse say? Jesus wept. All right? All right? It wasn't just a little tear pricking down it. I'm sure that he really cried heartfelt tears over the death of his friend Lazarus. Otherwise, John wouldn't have gone to the bother of recording it. All right? Jesus wept, which I'm sure was appreciated by the sisters and the other people gathered. But would that have comforted them really in the long term? All right? What they were looking for was for Jesus to do something, and he does. All right? He goes to the grave and shouts out, "Lazarus, come on out." And so he follows that feeling, those tears, with action, right, to make sure that Lazarus was raised, the sisters were comforted. There are lots of other examples as well. And the other next slide, please, Sam. All right, we've got in Mark 6, verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. In Matthew chapter 14, it says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Notice it wasn't just compassion as a feeling, which would have been nice and good, but it went further than that. Jesus went on to do something. He healed them. He taught them. All right? In Matthew 15, it says, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. Well, we know what followed that, don't we? We get the feeding of the 5,000. So, yes, he felt sorry for them. He felt compassion for them, but it was followed up with action, using the disciples and the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then another one in Matthew chapter 20, Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. All very, very good for him to go and speak to these people that were blind. He could have just left them in the gutter and they would have carried on begging for the rest of their life. But Jesus, that wasn't good enough for Jesus just to feel sorry for them. He had to do something about them. God's compassion, he was God inside of Jesus, meant that he had to follow through and do something to help the people he came into contact with. And then next slide, Sam. It's at the cross that we find the ultimate act of compassion. In John 15, as Laura read earlier, all right, we get, greater love has no one than this, than to lay one's life down for his friends. And as we've said, on Remembrance Sunday, we often quote these words and we remember the sacrifice of people that we don't know necessarily. Certainly going back the wars back, World War One, World War Two, there are people that perhaps we would, but so many years have gone on now that we don't know the people directly. But that doesn't mean to say we dismiss it. We remember with respect the sacrifice that they did in laying down their life. All right? For us, they're friends. We didn't have to go. They went and made the sacrifice. And we are thankful, so thankful for that. All right? But it's in the next slide, please, Sam. How it's in the sacrifice of Jesus that, of course, really speaks best of laying his life down for his friends? Or was it enemies? All right, we became his friends, but we were his enemies, as we see in this passage in Romans, which reads, you see, at just the right time. I think that's amazing. Just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, or perhaps a good cause, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. And since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? So that's the greatest display of God's compassion, that God made a way that we could be turned from enemies of God back to being friends with God, as God had always intended from the beginning in Genesis, that we would be his image, his reflection. So next slide, please, Sam. God's compassion shown by Christians. God's compassion is a heartfelt response to the needs of people, and our compassion should be a direct response to having experienced the compassion of God for you, for me. All right? Those of us here who would say that we are Christians, we have experienced the compassion of God in our life. An amazing level of compassion, as we've just seen at the cross. Those handprints show God's compassion for us. And so as we are called, Christians are called to show compassion in response to that. And I've got two references from our New Testament. So in Ephesians chapter 4, we read this. Be kind, Paul says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. So because God has forgiven us in Jesus, that means that we should be following through and being prepared to show the same spirit of compassion and forgiveness to others that Jesus showed to us. And if we're not, then we need to think about why we're not. Also, in 1 Peter chapter 3, we read this, finally. So Peter said all he wants to say, and then he starts this sentence with the word finally, as if, make sure you're listening to this bit, all right? Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. These were Peter's final instructions in the first letter of Peter to the people he was writing to. This is what he wanted to underline about how they should be behaving to one another and to the people outside of the church that they were seeking to reach. So we find in the stories that we read, particularly in Acts, of how the disciples became like Jesus. We saw how Jesus acted, healed the sick and fed the hungry and so on. So in the early church, we find the early Christians doing what Jesus had done. And so we get stories like the cripple that was healed by Peter and John at the beautiful gate of the temple. We get the project for caring for the widows in the church when the first deacons were appointed to help with serving at tables. We get the collections that were made in the various churches that were sent to help the church, the poor church in Jerusalem. We get the story of Dorcas, all right, where she died and everybody was very, very, very upset because she'd been sewing so many things, so many clothes for the needy, and now there'd be nobody to do that job. And so as a result, they raised Dorcas back to life. So we get all of those stories in our Bibles, and I'm sure if you just sat for a few minutes, you could think of loads of examples down through church history of people who followed God's compassion to them. They followed it up with action to try and make the world that they lived in a better place. They were working, it's kind of like Jesus. This is where I was saying that love in action, love putting its working clothes on and getting stuck in to deal with the problems in their society. People like who, in Victorian times, who went into prisons, who started hospitals, those kinds of people. In all countries, cities and individuals, the hands and feet of Jesus working amongst the community. And so then finally, the last slide, please, Sam. What's our response? What's our response? What about Bethel? At this particular point, when I spoke the last time, I spoke about Jesus is the same yesterday and today and forever, that God hasn't changed. God still has a mission for our church to fulfill. And I've just jotted down on the slide some of the things. It's not definitive. It's probably things that I've missed. These were the things that jumped out when I was writing. But, the things that we've done in the past. Compassion Children that we support. Lunch Club. Colour. The things we've done with colour. Blytheswood, the shoeboxes. Thank you, Lorraine, again. SGA Widows, we've supported at Christmas for a good many years. In recent years, our Heart for the Families gifts that we've done at Christmas time. More recently, the work that we've started in the Manor House Pantry. So these are things that we have done, but is that it? Do we draw a line under that and say, right, okay, God, we've done it. We can sign off now. So it's not the case, is it? All right. Paul, when he speaks about why he got up in the morning and walked the thousands of miles that he must have walked during his time travelling from church to church, setting up new churches and so on, and travelling across the sea. Why did he do it? Well, he said it's because the love of Christ compels me to do it. He didn't feel as though he got a choice in that sense. And I don't think that was a reluctant choice either. Sometimes you say, oh, I shall have to do it. And sort of you bite your lip and think, oh, grit your teeth and get on with it. But I don't think it was that kind of compel that Paul felt. He knew how much God had done for him. Remember, he was a real enemy of Christ. And God turned his life around. And he says, the love of Christ compelled him to action. What about you? What about me? It's not going to be pointing my fingers at you, is it? Because it's me as well. What does the love of Christ compel me to do? What does the love of Christ compel you to do? I want you to, just as we close, I want you to remember that first verse that I quoted from Exodus. I want you to remember that God, the compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, ever-loving and faithful God, that God that delivered you, that put his compassion into action with Jesus coming to die for you? How are you going to respond to the compassion that He has planted in your heart? Because if you are part of God's family, you should have God's compassion by the Holy Spirit in your heart. So how are you going to respond? How are you going to respond this week? And so just as I finish, I just want to sort of encourage you, we'll just have a minute. I want you to think about how will you show God's compassion this week? I'm not saying forget all of the other character traits that are mentioned in Exodus 34, because they're important, obviously. But just focus this week on that first one, compassion. How are you going to show God's compassion to someone this week? Remember the compassion you've received? Pass it on.